Hello, my name is Mark Klimek. I am a registered nurse and I am the president and CEO of Klimek Reviews. I'm welcoming you to a session called Rape Trauma Syndrome. It is part of our walk through the Blue Book series. Now, we have what we call Klimek Connect. If you're seeing me, you're part of Klimek Connect. It is a service where we, for free, give you access to videos and discussions about topics pertinent to nursing. We, throughout the year, are going to have things for students that are still in nursing school, for graduates, for the NCLEX, and for professional nurses starting in their career. But for this winter of 2024, we're going to be focusing on NCLEX preparation. And in order to do that, we're going to be doing what we call a series on Walk Through the Blue Book. Now, the Blue Book is a book that I wrote. It is a book of the knowledge base that you need to pass NCLEX. It's all facts. It's drill to learn facts. It's not multiple choice. It's not select all that apply. It's not to practice questions. It's to learn facts. Okay, because without the facts, you can't apply anything. What do you apply if you don't know the facts? So you've got to know the facts first. So this blue book is designed to help you learn the facts. So we're basing these sessions out of that blue book. We can't cover it all, but we're going to be covering important parts of it. We're trying to keep the sessions to 8 minutes or less so that you can see them on a weekly basis, sometimes bi-weekly, two a week. So this one is on rape trauma syndrome. It's episode 9 in our series. So if you just joined Klimek Connect, you can have access to the first 8. You can go back and look at those. Okay, well, let's talk about rape trauma syndrome. What is it? It is a psychological response to attempted or completed rape. Now, the key word there is attempted. A person doesn't have to have been raped to have rape trauma syndrome. If the rape was attempted, or the person perceives that it was attempted, they can have rape trauma syndrome because it is a psychological response to a trauma resulting from a rape type situation. Right? Most commonly is it experienced by females, but more frequently nowadays, you're seeing literature about this same syndrome in males who are victims. Now, every psych book has a totally different nomenclature, classificational system for the stages of rape trauma syndrome. Some have 2 stages, some have 3, some have 4. Okay? NCLEX can't get into 2 versus 3 versus 4. What they have to cover is what's common to all of them. Now, this session is in chapter 4 of the Blue Book, Psychological Adaptation. And it starts on page 73 on the latest edition. So if you have a Blue Book, get it out, chapter 4, page 73. We're talking about that now. So I'm going to go most simplistic because that's what NCLEX would do, go most basic, and say there are 2 phases, the disorganization phase and the reorganization phase. Now, let's talk about each. In the disorganization phase, which can last anywhere from days to weeks after the actual event, the person can have 3 basic responses. They can have what we call the expressed response, the controlled response, and the shock response. Okay, now, the expressed response is you're actually seeing emotions expressed that go from distraction, anger, grief, disorientation, depression. You're actually seeing the responses being expressed in psychological symptomatology. We're actually seeing psychological symptoms expressed. That's a common reaction in the disorganization phase. However, there are many people who are victims of rape who rationalize and intellectualize it, or just separate themselves from the anxiety and trauma by doing what we call the controlled response. So they act like nothing's happened. Like, oh yeah, this happened to me. They're very clinical. They talk about it in very uh, unemotional terms, very academic, very that you won't see any expression of psychological symptoms. They're extremely controlled. It's like they're just reporting. It sounds like they're reporting about somebody else. That's what it sounds like. And one of the biggest things that are operating there is what? What do you think is the big defense mechanism that's going on there? Kind of denial with some intellectualization. They're kind of subconsciously thinking it happened, but it didn't happen to me. I can just put it over here, and not have it be even something I'm concerned about. I'm just going to ignore it, deny it, suppress it. Okay, and you'll see those people do it that way. That is not a healthy response. That is as unhealthy, if not more unhealthy, than the expressed response. Okay, so the person who has it all together in the ER is not doing better than the person who's crying and losing it. Okay, then there's the shock response, and they're just disoriented. You ask them questions, and they don't express anything, and they don't talk about it clinically like in a controlled response. They're numb. They're just completely in shock. Uh, and this is a very common response to all crises situations, because rape trauma syndrome is a crisis. It's a crisis. And therefore, if you know anything about crisis resolution and crisis staging, that a lot of that applies here to rape trauma syndrome as well. It's a crisis. And one of the ways people do is they just walk around aimlessly. They may not even come in to the ER after it happened or it was attempted. They're so numb they just go home and sit down in a chair and whatever. Those are the people that fall through the cracks, and those are the ones that I wish there was some way we could find those cases more easily, because they just numb. Now, those are all three of those are ways to deal with the psychological trauma of the assault, of the violence, because rape trauma syndrome is violence. Okay, it's violence committed against another person. It is a victim. All right. Now, that's the reorganization phase, and hopefully through dignity, empathy, support, resources, they will make it through. Now, not all rape trauma syndromes patients, clients, victims need the same treatment, because they're different. See, they're responding differently. They need different things. Okay, so there is no fundamental rape trauma syndrome protocol psychologically. You have to deal with them. If they're disoriented, you deal with that. If they're depressed, you deal with that. If they're denial, you deal with that. If they're distracted, you deal with that. If they're not doing self-care, you deal with that. Okay? Then the reorganization phase happens weeks to months to possibly even years later. And it includes use of resources, it includes making some changes. And many rape trauma syndrome victims, rape victims, will make changes in their lives. Very few ever go back to life exactly as it was before. Almost everyone makes some slight change. Some make large changes. Some make sweeping changes. But everybody makes changes. And part of making those changes is that's part of the reorganization stage phase, making those changes. Now, when they make changes, that could be moving out of the city, out of the town, out of the state, changing locks on doors, changing your routine, changes. And it doesn't matter how small or how big the change is; those are not bad things. So don't try to argue them out of the changes. Don't say, "Oh, you don't have to move. You don't have to move. We want you around here." Well, who's that all about? That's about you. That's not about them. Okay? So allow them to make changes. Support their changes. If they want to drop out of college and go do, support it. Don't say, "Oh, you're just a week from graduation," and you don't even know. I mean, you don't even know. You don't know where they're at. Okay? So you support the change. The changes are not pathologic. All right? Okay. So I want to talk in conclusion just a little bit about some long-term fears that people who experience rape as a victim have. There are four basic fears. One is they are afraid of areas that are similar in look to the location where the incident took place. For example, if they were raped in a theater, they're going to avoid theaters. If they were raped at church, they're going to avoid church. Okay. They're going to be very afraid of being alone or in crowds. And you say, well, which one? Either, no, you can be afraid of being alone and you can be afraid of being in crowds. So what do you prefer? Small groups of people, one or two, or, I'm with one other person, two other person, people, three other people. They're going to be very nervous about people who are behind them, standing behind me. They're always going to scan. Many become very situationally surveillant. They obsess with surveilling the area, and they get nervous about people being behind them. They don't really like that at all. And then they have sexual fears about sexuality, fears about sexually transmitted disease, fears about all kinds of things that they have. And there are a lot of sexually transmitted diseases that have lifelong implications. And so they fear those four things. And one of the things that you want to pay attention to is those are, again, we would say maybe they're unreasonable, but we have to allow them the freedom to adjust and adapt in that way. All right. And just one other last thing is throughout the whole process when they're in the healthcare system, they should have a same gender, same sex uh, provider, I mean, not provider, but a healthcare worker in with them whenever they're being examined by the opposite sex or whatever the perpetrator was. So, those are things to remember about rape trauma syndrome. So, I hope that is helpful. If this was helpful, tell other people, have them join Thinkific and Klimek Connect on Thinkific. Think if ick. THINKIFIC. And you know because you're on it. All right. Have a good day, and I wish the best for you.